major powers, one disputed Himalayan border. India and China blame each other for confrontations over the past month. But why is this happening now? And could the tension trigger a military conflict? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Bernard Smith. Trouble is brewing at the roof of the world. India and China both claim territory along the Himalayas, the world's tallest mountain range. Their border dispute goes back decades, and tension is on the rise again. The Indian military says in the first week of May, Indian and Chinese soldiers scuffled and threw stones at each other in the Pangong Tso Lake and Naku La areas. Chinese state media say Indian troops trespassed on Chinese territory and accuse them of trying to build defence facilities. But India's government says its soldiers stayed on its side. Both sides appear to be bolstering their presence. An Australian security analyst posted these satellite pictures on Twitter last week. They appear to show both sides building more tents and roads within 5 kilometres of the line of actual control which separates the two armies. Diplomatic relations between India and China are deteriorating, as Katrina Yu explains from Beijing.
There's always been a dispute there about the territory, but in recent weeks it's been intensifying between PLA Chinese soldiers and Indian soldiers who disagree over the line of control. And because of this, we've had skirmishes, fistfights, no bullets fired yet, but there is a real fear that these scuffles, as they become more intense, could lead to all-out conflict.
China and India share one of the world's longest unmarked borders. Both have territorial claims on more than 3,500 kilometres of land. A month-long war in 1962 ended without any resolution. And there have been several standoffs since then, the latest in 2017. A year later, the Chinese and Indian leaders held talks to maintain peace in the region. Xi Jinping and Narendra Modi met again in October last year. Let's introduce our guests. In New Delhi, we have Brahma Chilleni, an author and professor of strategic studies at the Centre for Policy Research. He's a former advisor to India's National Security Council. In the German city of Leipzig, Adam Nie, a specialist on China's foreign policy and security issues. And in Bloomington, Indiana, Sumit Ganguly, a distinguished professor of political science at Indiana University, Bloomington. He's a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to you all. Brahma, I'll begin with you. After all this time, why now these flare-ups along this border?
It's a good question. President Xi Jinping believes that the pandemic is an opportunity for China to expand its influence. In fact, he told a university audience recently that great steps in history have always emerged from the crucible of major disasters. So we see Xi Jinping expanding his agenda, trying to decimate Hong Kong's local autonomy. He has made moves in the South China Sea, including setting up 2 new administrative districts. The Chinese Coast Guard last month rammed and sank a Vietnamese fishing boat, and now we are seeing border flare-ups with India. So what's happening on the Himalayan frontier needs to be seen in the broader context in which Xi Jinping is advancing his expansionist agenda at a time when the world is grappling with the China-originating pandemic.
Adam, is that what it is? China thinks the world's attention has been diverted and it is seeking to establish strength along the Himalayan-Indian border?
Yeah, I would certainly disagree with that. I think both India and China are both have been heavily affected by the pandemic so far, and both have an interest in maintaining peace while they tackle domestic challenges, and especially so Beijing, given that Beijing has plenty of challenges to deal with in Hong Kong, Xinjiang, economic recovery, as well as its important relationship with the US, which has taken a very confrontational turn, and just to name a few. So it doesn't need another confrontation at this point in time. But at the same time, I think the leaders in Beijing doesn't want to appear weak if this was to escalate. especially at a time where the domestic public is anxious about China's near-term future. I think it's certainly true that we need to see this in the wider sweep of Chinese strategic thinking and ambitions. But I would just like to point out that there's a lack of clarity on exactly what has happened up to this point, given that media reports have so far been uncollaborated by official sources. And it's really fueling speculation on what has happened. So we're not exactly sure what happened yet, so let's not jump to a conclusion.
Sumit, why do you think we're hearing more reports of confrontations up there along the Himalaya borders between India and China? Why now?
I largely think because the Chinese have taken a more assertive posture and are probably probing India's capabilities and resolve along the border. This is something that has actually been going on for the last several years. In fact, I would trace this back to 2014 when Xi Jinping visited India, and in the midst of that visit, there were a series of incursions that took place. And it's hard for me to believe that a local commander would have taken the initiative to undertake incursions while the president was visiting in India. That really stretches the imagination to a breaking point. So there is actually a pattern of incursions, and this is the latest thereof. And I think it has much to do with China feeling the frustration of the global community with its very opaque handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. And at a moment also when India is sort of fitfully moving closer to the United States. And this is clearly a message from Beijing saying that, we can create troubles for you along the border if you try to cozy up to the United States.
Brahma, there have been confrontations up there before. We've seen fists thrown between both sides, but they've always calmed down in the past. Why would it not calm down this time?
Because what's happening now is far more serious than what we have seen in many years. In fact, it's not just one incursion. Sumit was mentioning the 2014 incursion when President Xi Jinping arrived in New Delhi. He came with this encroachment. Now we have several incursions that have happened in the northern Ladakh region, at least 4 standoffs as of today between Chinese and Indian troops, because the Chinese have entered up to 3 kilometers beyond the line of control. So we have confrontations at several points. And therefore, de-escalating all these different confrontations will require the political leadership, both in Beijing and in New Delhi, to be able to engage and sort matters out. And given the pressure that President Xi faces, he's playing the nationalist card at home. He doesn't want to be seen as weak. He has upped the ante vis-a-vis several of its neighbors, including countries in Southeast Asia. For example, ramming and sinking a Vietnamese fishing boat. And Vietnam is a friendly neighbor of China. That was one example of several in recent weeks where China has utilized the pandemic to assert itself. But what is happening along the China-India frontier is a very serious situation that can potentially go out of control if things do not calm down.
Adam, you can see why from the Indian side, India might feel more defensive. It's spending $71 billion on defence last year. China spent $261 billion on defence. But these situations have calmed down up there in the past. Could this escalate, do you think?
There's certainly a possibility that this would escalate. So, I guess there are various reasons, various theories why we think this is happening. But one of these, of course, as previously mentioned, is the increased activity up there. This is a very remote part of the world, but increasingly there are more infrastructure construction and military infrastructure in the border areas, right? So this is both sides, both Indians and the Chinese are developing these assets. And now with the warmer weather, there are just more border patrols along the region, leading to more frictions between frontline officers, which, you know, a lot of them are resolved, but some of them clearly could go out of control. So and finally, I just want to point out that there's actually a lack of consensus on the both sides as to the line of actual control. So, and that really leads to the perception on both sides that the other side is being aggressive, and that they themselves are only responding to the pressure from the other side. So I think both sides have that perception.
Sumit, why has it been so difficult to establish an official border along there? There was a mechanism set up in 2003 of special representatives to sort this out. Is somebody stalling?
I think the principal problem is that the Chinese have time on their side. They can well afford to stretch this out, and they're the ones who have the most expansive claims. So let's be clear about this, that they are the revisionist power. The Indians do not have claims that on Chinese territory. It's the PRC that has significant claims and initiated the war in 1962. Subsequently, there was a clash in 1967 and again in 1986. And the 67 and 86 clashes were quite significant. And there have been 20 rounds already, possibly even 21. I'm losing track now of discussions of attempts to settle the border, but the progress has been really glacial, and principally because the Chinese are not especially forthcoming in terms of what they deem to be is the appropriate border.
Brahma, what is the strategic value up there to either India or China? Is there any strategic value aside from asserting dominance?
These borderlands in the Himalayas are of strategic value both to China and to India. In fact, mention was made of the line of control not being clear. There are some areas, for example, the Sikkim-Tibet border, where the international border is mutually recognized. And yet, in recent weeks, we have seen tensions and flare-ups even along that internationally recognized border. There's another sector, the middle sector of the India-China frontier, where the two sides have actually exchanged maps with each other, showing their claim lines. So each side knows where the line of control lies. Yet in recent days, the Chinese have built up forces along that middle sector, and there have been attempts to intrude into the Indian side. So it's not just lack of clarity. Even where the line is clear, there have been incidents. The reason is that Chinese troops, meter by meter, mile by mile, are seeking to redraw the line of control in the Himalayas. They're trying to grab vantage points overlooking enemy positions. So it's all about having the advantage militarily. This is why we are seeing China today having intruded at 4 different points in the Ladakh region, is now sitting pretty, compounding India's dilemma, because India's choices are quite terrible.
Okay.
Is it willing to go to war with China? Because the Chinese came in suddenly. At each point, there are at least 800 to 1,000 Chinese that have set up heavily fortified encampment. Now, evicting them will require military action, and military action will lead to a full-fledged war. So India faces a very difficult dilemma.
Okay.
That's the reason why the political leadership in New Delhi is keeping quiet, because if they admit these incursions, public pressure will build up on the leadership to evict the encroachers.
Okay.
And that any kind of action will lead to war.
Forgive me. Okay, Adam, is that it? China is not pushing to establish these borders because it's going to assert itself militarily first, and then from that position of strength, then it might try and talk later.
I mean, certainly that's the pattern we've seen other territorial disputes, for example, in the South China Sea, where, China is building up its forces and assets in the region, despite the lack of clarity of its sweeping claims in the South China Sea. I do think there is a possibility that this might escalate if nationalist opinion in both countries becomes quite strong on this issue, and I think it will be if this goes on for much longer in the media. And that's going to pressure both governments to adopt tougher measures against each other, leading to a higher chance of escalation.
Sumit, let me move on to what Adam says there. We have an increasingly assertive China under Xi Jinping and a more overtly nationalist India under Narendra Modi. Will that cause problems if this continues, if these confrontations continue?
I certainly think so, particularly if these Chinese provocations continue, because you see there's a larger pattern over here. Faced with criticism on their lack of transparency on the COVID-19 issue, China has also engaged in what they're referring to themselves as wolf warrior diplomacy. They're a very aggressive stance which suggests that the problem didn't emanate in China. They have floated all manner of bizarre theories about the United States being responsible for having released this virus on the world. And simultaneously bear in mind that they have gotten away with their rather expansive claims in the South China Sea. The Obama administration did not confront them fully, and the Trump administration has waxed and waned in terms of its response. And consequently, at a time when they are feeling pressured by the global community on other issues, they are asserting themselves in a range of areas and trying to divert attention away from the COVID-19 issue, in which they are clearly culpable.
Brahma, you have got a more assertive India, nationalist India under Narendra Modi. Could his hand be forced if these confrontations continue, or does he realise he can't take on the Chinese?
I think Modi faces embarrassment over what's happening because he has made better relations with China a major foreign policy priority. Ever since he came to office, he's been trying to mend relations with China. For example, in 2014, just after he came to office, he postponed a trip to Japan by 6 weeks so that he could first host Xi Jinping as the first world leader. And more recently, in the last couple of years, there has been the Wuhan summit between Modi and Xi Jinping. And a few months ago, they had another summit in India, in Chennai. And all these were Modi's own initiatives. As President Xi said, that it was Modi who proposed hosting the Wuhan summit. So the escalation of tensions, the confrontations that we are witnessing are for Modi a matter of embarrassment. But if I could make a broader point, China has been assertive vis-a-vis several of its neighbors, but has had no significant geopolitical price to pay. For example, it has fundamentally changed the status quo in the South China Sea without firing a shot, and yet there have been no international consequences for its actions in the South China Sea. Similarly, 1 million or more Muslims have been detained in Xinjiang, but China has faced no international sanctions. And now China is seeking to decimate Hong Kong's constitutional autonomy. If it succeeds in undoing Hong Kong's autonomy without facing any international consequences, then you can be sure that it will turn the Sino-Indian frontier into a zone of perennial conflict.
All right, Adam, can I ask you, just moving away from the border a bit, China's got controls a key port in Sri Lanka now. India nervous about that, even though China's military isn't allowed to use it. India has pause to be concerned about China's motives in that part of the world, doesn't it, when you add what it's doing in Sri Lanka and what's happening on the border together?
Yeah, surely it does. I mean, also China's relationship with Pakistan, for example, is a critical, thorny issue in China-India relations. So India has plenty to worry about a rising China, about one that's more assertive and more and expansionist. At the same time, however, India and China have a lot of common interests. They're both rising powers, so that if they compete fiercely, then it's to both of their detriment. So I think I think today there are pressures both to cooperate with each other, but as well as to compete.
And Sumit, again, about that port in Sri Lanka that China now controls, its military is not allowed to use it. But obviously India's worried about that. It's worried about the Himalaya border. Does India have something to worry about, or should it really see China as a partner?
Well, there are areas where China and India have cooperated, but these have been fleeting moments of cooperation based upon exigent circumstances. For example, briefly at the World Trade Organization, earlier on issues of climate change, but these have been at particular moments. Ultimately, we have to recognize that there is a strategic rivalry between China and India, and China sees India as the principal impediment to the realization of its interests in dominating most of Asia. And India's growing closeness with Japan and the United States worries the Chinese because on its own, India cannot do very much because of the sheer disparities of power in a number of different material realms, whether it's economics, whether it's military power, or even diplomatic prowess. But if India successfully manages to build a set of strategic relationships with, say, Vietnam, with Australia, with the United States and Japan, then India becomes a much more formidable rival. And this is something that the Chinese clearly do not want to countenance.
So, Sumit, can I just then quickly ask you, you were talking about how China's handling a coronavirus before. India has taken over the chairmanship of the World Health Organization's executive board. Is that going to cause stresses between India and China in the coming months as the pressure builds for an inquiry into the origins of coronavirus?
Much depends on how the Indian minister, who has now taken over as the chairman of the board, responds. If he behaves in a timid fashion and kowtows to the Chinese, then I suspect there will be little or no reason for friction or further tensions. On the other hand, if he takes a more assertive position and seeks a dispassionate inquiry into the origins of this crisis, then I fear that the Chinese will almost invariably escalate on other fronts.